Go to Egypt, stay there, and wait for my instructions. Why? Because Herod's going to seek the young child to destroy him. Obey, wait for further instructions. This is very good advice for life. Obey God, and then wait for our next instructions. Do what we know is right, do what we know what God has told us to do, and then wait for further instructions. Joseph is going to have to live not just by faith, but by obedience. Today, in the time that I have, I wanted to bring you some thoughts around that reading we had from Matthew's account of the Christmas story. I suppose Christmas Day for all of us is a special day. It has good memories of past Christmases, create some new ones. Every family is different. We have some additions, subtractions to our families, some here, some away. Everyone is different. Everyone is different. For some, this is a very hard day. It's a more difficult day of the year. For believers, there is another dimension to all this. There's another dimension, whether this is a good day or hard day for you. For Christians, there's another dimension that transcends whatever we are going through in our own families and lives. It's that God visited the world through his Son. God sent his Son into the world, and that truth for us changes everything. It changes everything. It changes every dynamic, changes every challenge, every blessing for that matter. Everything is put into perspective because of the truth that God sent his Son into the world, and for those who have believed on him, that truth changes every day of our life. Has it changed yours today? Let me ask you that. Does it change you? Is your faith in Jesus Christ alone for your salvation? Yet it's easy for us to forget that when, just in reading this first Christmas account, immediately after those birth of Christ and the days that followed, that really the first Christmas was fairly traumatic. It was fairly traumatic for all concerned. In Matthew 1, Joseph, this godly man, receives the very shock of his life. His fiancée is expecting and he is not the father. The angel says, "Don't worry, marry her." Imagine getting that sort of news. Don't worry, marry her. God's at work. There's a miracle that's occurred. Marry her. And he does. He does that very thing. The first Christmas was a traumatic time, but you get into Matthew 2 and things seem to get worse. More trauma, more conflict comes at the birth of Jesus Christ. We know he was born in Bethlehem, this little town 10 kilometres south of Jerusalem. Today, Bethlehem is now part of what is known as the West Bank. Very hard to visit this Christmas for Christians. Very, very difficult place to visit. Or you could call it Judea Samaria. That's been known throughout history. Bethlehem was historically the house of bread, a great name for a place where Jesus, the bread of life, would be born and would come and be fed from innumerable who have put their faith in him. Matthew 2 talks about the wise men, the Magi, the wise men from the east as far as Persia. We assume there were three because there were three gifts. There were three gifts, and of course you got the Christmas carol, We Three Kings, that confused things even more. I remember one Christmas many years ago we were having a sing-along, We Three Kings, and someone, didn't like singing We Three Kings. We don't know if they're kings, so I suggested we're going to sing We Three Things. And that sorted everything. Everyone could sing with a good conscience. But actually there were a number of wise men, but maybe hundreds who were part of their train who came. We know that because all of Jerusalem was in uproar when these men and probably their entourage come with them from the east. They had been following this special star. They were likely powerful political players, maybe astrologers. Remember in the Old Testament, the kings and the pharaohs, they had their wise men. They had those that were crafty. Many were con men, certainly, but certainly many outstanding leaders and spiritists, and the best that a pharaoh or king could assemble. And we have these wise men from the east, from Persia, that were open to really the voice of God. They saw a star they hadn't seen before, and so they followed that star as it rested over the place where Jesus was born. It's been said that in the ancient world at that time there were these sort of rumours going on around the ancient world that someone really important was coming onto the world scene just at that time. One historian, Suetonius, said that around the birth of Jesus, there had spread over all the Orient an old and established belief that it was fated at that time for men coming from Judea to rule the world. This cusp of the earth, the world, is about to have this new dawn, this new age. Even the Jewish historian Josephus said that about the time of Christ's birth, the Jews believed that one from their country would soon become ruler of the habitable earth. Now, there was always the expectation of Messiah coming at some point, but their interest seemed to have been piqued at the time that Jesus came. And so these wise men come to Herod, who was then king of Israel, set by Augustus Caesar. Herod was not a Roman, he was Idumean, he was an Edomite. One of the descendants of Esau. Edom had a long hostility with the nation of Israel. Herod, you know, was a cruel man without mercy. We're going to be looking shortly at the murder of the innocents. How could a man do that to little children? Well, he had a wife and 3 of his sons, mother-in-law, brother-in-law killed, drowned for fear of a rival. Well, he could do it to his own. He could be savage to his own. Herod knew that no one was going to weep when he died, and so he orchestrated that a number of prominent citizens in Jerusalem would be arrested. So he had them arrested, and when he came close to death, he organised so that when he died, the moment he died, these other citizens whom he had arrested would also be put to death, so that there would be some weeping in Jerusalem. This is the kind of man that was in charge of Israel. No wonder he couldn't handle anyone coming to ask him, who is he that is born king of the Jews? Then the implication is, Herod, you're just a stand-in. Herod, you're temporary. Herod, someone's coming to replace you at some point. Herod couldn't stand the fact that these great men had come to worship, not him, but someone else. And of course he consults the Jewish scribes and priests in Matthew 2, and the scribes, they know the book of Micah. In fact, they quote to Herod the book of Micah. It's going to be out of Bethlehem, a ruler's going to come. And yet the scribes and the chief priests aren't visiting Bethlehem. Isn't that interesting? They knew the town. They have these powerful men coming. They're ready to come and worship. The implication is he's been born. These Jewish priests know the place, but they're not visiting and they're not worshipping. It's interesting, isn't it? Not even 10 kilometres from God's Son. Not even 10 kilometres away. And they will not come to worship. Much like people today. A lot of people would say, sure, Jesus was born. No question, no doubt, no problem. It's a good thing. It's a good thing. And not sure, we've noticed this week walking a little bit, We've seen some Halloween and Christmas decorations up simultaneously. Simultaneously. I suppose they're going to add the Easter bunny, right? In a few months' time. Just keep adding the stuff, So lots of people think that Jesus was born, and that's all very good, but it never actually translates to worshipping him. It's a great danger. It's a great danger. Now Herod seeks to deceive these wise men, but they're not that stupid. They're not that stupid. And he says, "Look, you go find Jesus, and you let me know, and I'll come and let's worship him." And of course, they do the exact opposite. The exact opposite. And they bring those gifts of gold, frankincense, and myrrh. But then things are about to get worse in this first Christmas story. Did you notice there were two recurring themes as we read from Matthew 2 today? Or phrases, I should say, phrases. In verse 13, 14, 20 and 21, you have this phrase, the young child and his mother. Now that's significant because I always talk about mother and child, right? You always talk about the mother and child. But 4 times, the young child and his mother. This wasn't any child. This wasn't any baby. This wasn't any infant. This was the child. The priority of the son. His priority. We have to be reminded of the priority of the son this year. It's about Jesus. It wasn't really even about Mary, as important as the role she had. And then there's another expression just 3 times, that it might be fulfilled. There are no accidental details in this story. There's no accidental details. All that happens, for good or ill, had been predicted by God hundreds of years earlier and would be certainly fulfilled by those who were participating in this drama. And you have the angel in verse number 13 coming to Joseph again and saying, "Arise, take the young child and his mother, flee to," and it's like, where are they going to flee to? Flee to Egypt. Egypt. What a place for God's son to go. Man, do you know how much trouble Israel had getting out of Egypt? There's a whole book on it. It's called Exodus. Egypt. Go to Egypt, and then I want you to stay there until I say otherwise. Go to Egypt, stay there, and wait for my instructions. Why? Because Herod's going to seek the young child to destroy him. Obey, wait for further instructions. This is very good advice for life. Obey God, and then wait for our next instructions. Do what we know is right, do what we know what God has told us to do, and then wait for further instructions. Joseph is going to have to live not just by faith, but by obedience. By obedience. Yes, we live by faith, but we have a book that guides us along the way. It's not just a faith in whatever we want our life to be. It's trust in what God has revealed and obedience to his word that really counts. So this is very good advice. And look at how quickly Joseph obeys. Look at verse 14. When he arose, he took the young child and his mother by night. No nice goodbyes, no extended farewells. It seems like they went that night. If they wait, you lose the element of surprise. They're going to go by evening and they're going to depart to Egypt. This trip is long and hard, 300 kilometres. If you're doing that by foot, that's many days. If you do that with a donkey, some animals, right? It's gonna take days to do. And isn't it interesting that they don't go to Egypt on the wings of the angel, right? Why can't the angel just take him over there? I mean, he appeared to Joseph. Angels have done greater things in the Bible than moving a few people from here to there. It's not a miraculous exit. They leave at night to avoid detection. They probably use those gifts from the wise men as travel expenses and expenses to live in Egypt, maybe for a few months, maybe a little bit longer. Why Egypt? Because it was a place where, at least when Jesus was a grown man, had as many as 1 million Jews there living in Alexandria. It was a place where Joseph and Mary could have been right at home. It was Alexander the Great who created a sanctuary city for the Jews in Egypt. See, God was working providentially. And so they could live among Jews, as Jews. For that time, they were safe, away from Herod. Alexandria was a place that had a great library. It was a place where the translation of the Old Testament Hebrew into Greek was compiled a few hundred years earlier out of Egypt. Egypt. God can use the most unlikely places, the most unlikely people, to fulfill his will. Because everything belongs to the Lord. Ultimately, everything belongs to him. All the trouble they had in getting out of Egypt. Look at verse 15 of Matthew 2. They're there till the death of Herod, that it might be fulfilled, which was spoken by the Lord through the prophet, saying, out of Egypt I've called my son. It's taken from Hosea. And when you read Hosea, it's clearly about the Exodus. You know? It's about the Exodus. But Matthew says, hold on a second. There is an ultimate Exodus. There's an ultimate Exodus. There's going to be an ultimate deliverance. There's going to be an ultimate saving from the plagues of sin. And that's through Jesus Christ. Just as Moses and the nation went out of Egypt, so Jesus Christ, God's unique son, he called Israel his son in the book of Exodus. Now we have his unique eternal son going through that same pathway, as it were. Out of Egypt I've called my son. In verse 16, Herod's very, very angry. He's angry because the wise men treated him the way he treated them. He deceived them, they deceived him, and he's upset. He's upset. He had no reason to be. But in great anger, he turns his deathly attention, to these infants, little boys 2 and under. And let me try and put it this way. Some people think that very few little boys were actually killed. Very few. Now, you know that 1 or 2 is awful. 20 or 30, we don't really know. We know that there's nothing about the secular history of Herod that talks about this event. It could have been quite a small number, as revolting as that is, as revolting as it is. Nothing was going to get in the way of Herod's power. Nothing would. Not even children, not even infants. But don't the same things happen today? The same things happen today. Man has not learned a thing from his own sin. So my question today is this just about Herod versus Jesus? Is this just about this local king in Israel? And is it just about these parents? Is something bigger going on? Well, let me just read this in Revelation 12. Let me just read what John says looking back. He says, he saw a great sign appeared in heaven, a woman clothed with the sun, with moon under her feet, on her head a garland of 12 stars. That's like Joseph, sun, moon and stars bowing down to him. This is Israel. Then, being with child, she cried out in labour and in pain to give birth. Israel's going to give birth to a child, right? This is the first coming of Jesus. This is Christmas. John's looking back. And then he sees another sign in heaven. Behold, a great fiery red dragon, with 7 heads, 10 horns, 7 diadems on his heads. Explain that another time. Sees this great dragon. His tail drew a third of the stars of heaven, threw them to the earth. That's the rebellion of a third of the angels. But then look at what he says. He says, the dragon stood before the woman who was ready to give birth to devour her child as soon as it was born. You have the dragon standing by the woman. That's Satan. That's not Herod. Herod was a willing instrument of Satan. Satan was there in the Christmas story. Just like he was there tempting Adam and Eve in the garden, Satan's there in the wilderness. When Jesus tempted as a grown man, he is there behind Judas at the betrayal. Satan keeps on popping up. He keeps on trying to derail the plan of God. But then verse 17 and 18 of Matthew 2 tells us that there's another prophecy, Jeremiah saying, a voice heard in Ramah, lamentation, weeping, and great mourning, Rachel weeping for her children, refusing to be comforted because they are no more. Bethlehem's first mentioned at the burial of Rachel. Rachel, she dies giving birth to a son, Benoni, son of my sorrow. Jacob, the father, steps in and says he's going to be Benjamin, son of my right hand. You see the connections. Jesus, a man of sorrows. Jesus, the son of God's right hand. Jacob makes a pillar to mark Rachel's grave near Bethlehem. And Jeremiah makes this prophecy 600 years before Jesus was born, and it's about Rachel crying for the exiles. She's crying for the exiles. Why? Because Rachel gives birth to Benjamin, later Joseph. And you know what happens? They have generations to follow, and then those generations are dying. They're dying. Her grandchildren, so to speak, are dying. They're in exile. Terribly depressing. It's like Rachel says, I gave my life to bear a son, and now his descendants are no more. You see, Bethlehem was a birthplace of Jesus, but it was a place of death for those innocents. It was a place of blood. It was a place of innocent sacrifice. But then Jesus himself would come and die on the cross for our sins. His was the ultimate sacrifice. He was the innocent one put to death at Calvary. And then you have, of course, in 19 and 20 of Matthew 2, Herod dying. This tyrant dies and perishes in his sin and faces the true judge for his crimes. And Joseph can go back now. He can go back. He will be safe. He'll be safe. We know that Herod died in about AD 60. About 4 BC. Jesus born sometime between 6 and 5 BC. Look at verse 20. The angel appears to Joseph. Arise, take the young child and his mother, go to the land of Israel, for those who sought the young child's life are dead. They're all dead. Moses had a similar appearance by God in Exodus 4:19, when he says to Moses in Midian, go return to Egypt, for all the men who sought your life are dead. They're all gone. Moses is free to return, this time to Egypt. Now Jesus is free to go back home. If you look at verse 22 of Matthew 2, when he heard that Archelaus, this is son of Herod, was reigning, he's afraid to go there. This guy's just as bad as his father, that it might be fulfilled which was spoken by the prophets, he shall be called a Nazarene. And so Jesus Christ goes back with his earthly parents. He's going to be safe. The prophecy is that he's going to be called a Nazarene. A Nazarene. You can look from Genesis through to Malachi. There's nothing that says he shall be called a Nazarene with that wording. But Matthew talks about the prophets plural. And we know from the New Testament that to be called a Nazarene was to be called sort of the lowest of the low. The lowest of the low. The word Nazarene has this idea of a shoot or a branch, and so maybe this is Christ, the branch from the book of Isaiah. Either way, Scripture is being fulfilled. It's coming to pass. So what's happening in this chapter today, finally? God moves, Satan counter moves, and then God countermands Satan's move. Every counterstep Satan has, God has a final triumphant step. Satan couldn't stop the first Christmas. Couldn't stop it. And he couldn't stop other things that Jesus wanted to do either in God's will. Let me just finish today by reading that last verse of the prophecy in Revelation 12. It says in Revelation 12:5, she bore a male child who was to rule all nations with a rod of iron, and her child was caught up to God and his throne. That's how the story ends. The dragon tries to devour the infant, fails. He grows up. He's going to rule the nations with a rod of iron. In the meantime, he is ascended up to heaven. Revelation 12:1 through to 5. A Christmas on the run. So, your Christmas today and mine today is not going to be as traumatic as this first one. Not going to be as traumatic as this first one. But you and I can have the same promises and the same blessings that those participants did who loved Jesus, who worshipped him, who brought gifts to him. Sometimes at great personal danger. We have Joseph and Mary fleeing with the Lord, surrendering their lives to his welfare and to God's mission. Wouldn't it be good if Christians could surrender their lives to the mission of God today and the kingdom of God today, as Joseph and Mary did, totally committed to him?